Joining me now to talk about that and more is Congressman Khanna. He represents the 17th District, covering much of Silicon Valley. Congressman, nice to have you here.
Great to be back.
Well, this week the House passed a GOP-led tax reform bill. The Senate is now working on its own version. What do you think of Republican efforts to change the tax code?
Well, they're basically giving tax cuts to corporations at the expense of middle-class families. That is their priority. They're eliminating deductions for graduate students. They're eliminating deductions for medical expenses. They're eliminating deductions for state or local property taxes. To pay for what? To pay for tax cuts for corporations.
You have proposed your own tax idea. It's a $1 trillion plan, though. What would it do?
Well, here's the difference. Their theory of the case is you cut taxes for corporations and that somehow that's going to raise wages or create jobs. My point is, if you want to raise wages, just raise wages. What we ought to be doing is giving the tax credit to working families and the middle class. And you can do that. You can actually have every American making under $75,000 have a 20% pay increase for less cost than the entire Republican plan. You give money to people in the middle class and working class. They're going to spend it. They're going to buy products. That's going to create jobs. Corporate profits are at a record high. They don't need more tax cuts.
You won your seat last year by challenging an 8-term incumbent, Mike Khanna. Now you're voicing concerns about Dianne Feinstein, another long-term politician, basically saying you don't think she should run for re-election. Why?
Well, I didn't say I don't think she should run. I said she should be challenged. Everyone has the right to run, and she certainly has the right to make her case. But I think that there should be a challenge to her because it's time for new ideas, and there are things where she has been wrong.
Such as?
She voted for the war in Iraq. She was a strong champion for the Patriot Act and restricting civil liberties. On fiscal policy, economic policy, she voted for extending the Bush tax cuts to the very wealthy. I believe we need a more restrained foreign policy. I believe we need to stand up for civil liberties. I believe we need economic policy geared at the middle class and not just at the investor class. So I think she has done some good things. She's been a lead spokesperson on gun safety. She has delivered for the state of California on getting fundings for electrification. But her record, in my view, doesn't reflect California's values.
But yet you support and continue to support Nancy Pelosi. Isn't she part of the old guard too?
But she's been on the right side of history. She opposed the war in Iraq, unlike Dianne Feinstein. She's been a champion for universal health care and led the fight to have the Affordable Care Act. She was one of the most vociferous opponents of Bush's tax cuts. So I don't think this is a matter of the time in office. It's a person's values. Dianne has been on the wrong side of history on some of the biggest issues of her time. Nancy has been on the right side of history.
Your district includes some of the most well-known tech companies. You've got Apple, Intel, Tesla. There's a perception that tech companies tend to focus only on issues of concern to them, things like encryption or tax repatriation. What are some of the challenges in getting them to think beyond that?
That's a great question, and I've noticed a change. You have Google now out in Pittsburgh announcing a $1 billion fund to help people for jobs of the future. I saw Tim Cook saying that business leaders have a responsibility to care about jobs and to care about education, and he said that in Iowa. And you see Oracle creating partnerships with historically black colleges. So I think this election was a wake-up call for the Valley. They understand they're part of a larger country. They understand there are many people who feel excluded from this economy, and they want to be part of making sure the prosperity is shared.
And do you think they get it? Companies like Facebook, Google, and Twitter, for example, recently testified before Congress about how their platforms were used by Russians to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. Do you think that they actually get it, and are you confident that they are willing and able to prevent this from happening again?
Well, I think they understand that these platforms were abused, and the platforms have created a lot of good. They've allowed for dissident voices. They've allowed for Barack Obama to become president. They allowed for Bernie Sanders to come out of nowhere. But they've also been abused by bots that spread misinformation campaigns. They've become channels of hate speech, and that's hate speech has often been amplified. So the question is, how do these companies identify these bots? How do they make sure that they prevent misinformation? And that's not an easy issue, but I hope they will work on that. They have to work on that before the 2018 election.
You are now approaching the end of your freshman year in office. Given what you know now, what's the one piece of advice that you wish someone had told you before you took office?
Relationships. The relationships in Congress make a big difference.
You also said, though, that you were surprised by the level of anger at Congress.
I was. I mean, I understood that being a challenger, that people were frustrated, but what has been surprising is people have lost their esteem for Congress. They've lost a sense of the nobility of public service. They feel that Congress has let them down, that they haven't done anything. We hear all these allegations of sexual harassment and that the same rules don't apply. And I think regardless of party, regardless of geography, those of us who have the privilege of being one of 435 people who are helping shape the laws of this country, we need to do something to re-earn that public trust. That has to be our highest purpose. How do we reclaim the sense that we're working for the people and that we're part of this great deliberative body?
All right. Congressman Khanna, thank you for coming in and joining us today.
Thank you for having me.